There we go. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, I just lost you, but okay. Yisro's identity. Few of the weekly Torah readings are named after individuals, so whenever such an association is made, it commands special attention. And if this is true with regard to other Torah readings, it surely applies to Parshas Yisro, the story of the giving of the Torah. Naming the reading Yisro indicates a connection between him and the event.
Okay, so I guess he's going to kind of raise the question. Yisro was a wonderful fellow, the father-in-law of Moses, but that his name should be the name associated with perhaps the most significant, in a sense, parsha of the entire Torah, namely the parsha that tells about the giving of the Torah. So there's got to be a very, and obviously is, which we're going to discover, a deep and intrinsic connection between the cosmic giving of the Torah, where God tells us the purpose of creation, how to get there, the role of the Jewish people vis-a-vis the rest of the world. All of that is in this week's parsha. And it's all called Jethro or Yisro. Let's find out why. Please continue.
Who is Yisro? The Torah describes him as the Cohen of Midian. Our sages offer two definitions for the word Cohen. A, ruler. Yisro governed the land of Midian. B, priest. He led the Midianites in their worship. Indeed, our sages relate that Yisro had recognized all the false divinities in the world.
All right, so it's a bit of a context. You know the story that Moses has to flee, Moishe Rabbeinu has to flee Egypt because he had killed the Egyptian taskmaster that was mercilessly beating a hapless Jew. You know the story there. And he flees and he spends 7 years in Midian, and that's where he marries the daughter of Yisro, right?
Mm-hmm.
And has two sons, and Yisro eventually joins them. So who was he? And the Torah begins, this week's Torah, with Yisro heard what had happened, the Exodus and the crossing of the Red Sea, and he joins the Jewish people. So the Torah describes him as a Kohen. So you just shared with us, Peggy, the two meanings of the word Kohen. He was a leader where he was, and he was a priest. Our sages tell us that he left not one idolatrous worship, one religion unexplored in seeking the truth. He had experienced it all. Let's continue.
The connection between the first interpretation and the giving of the Torah is obvious, for it reflects the extent of Yisro's commitment. Although he lived amidst wealth and comfort, he was prepared to journey into the desert to hear the words of the Torah. But the second interpretation is problematic. Our sages teach that it is forbidden to tell a convert, remember your previous deeds.
It's a very strong question. All right. That we're told that why the Torah would call him a Kohen is to tell us he was a leader. That makes sense. He was a leader who had obviously power and honor and left it all to convert and join the ranks of the Jewish people. But the second explanation, that he's called a Kohen because he had served every idolatrous practice, that itself is a violation of the law. We are not to remind a convert of their idolatrous or unsavory past. So how do we justify the second meaning describing or defining the word Kohen? The Torah means to tell us this? How could this be? And this is the name of the parsha for which the Torah is given. So it's very strange, and that's a question we're going to understand. Peggy, read one more. It was a short one.
Sure. Recognizing deities, acknowledging God. To resolve this question, it is necessary to understand the source of idol worship. The Rambam writes, during the time of Enosh, mankind made a great error. They said that God created stars and spheres with which to control the world. He placed them on high and treated them with honor. Accordingly, it is fit for man to praise and glorify these entities and to treat them with honor. Thus, the worship of false divinities is rooted in a misunderstanding of the fact that God influences this world through intermediaries.
Let's elaborate somewhat. The Rambam was explaining and kind of addressing an obvious question. How did the world ever become idolatrous, idol worshiping, when God spoke to Adam, God spoke to Noah? There was obviously, if not a direct experience, but a tradition passed down with respect to an omnipotent creator, omnipresent creator, and so on. So the Rambam explains it didn't happen overnight. It was a whole process. There was an era. And there's much more detail than we're given here. And what happened was, people started saying that, of course, this God, that was tradition, they all knew that, but it's appropriate, they said, to give honor to the agencies that God employs, providing us with our needs. The sun, the moon, warmth, fire, etc. Not unlike the king sends you a gift. You say thank you to the messenger. Of course, the gift comes from the king, but it would be disrespectful to the king not to say thank you to the messenger that he has chosen. Now, that's how it began. And then it was exploited by leaders who said, well, okay, so we're going to erect these temples, these different temples, honoring the various forces of nature. I am the divinely appointed priest or leader of this temple. So all the offerings have to come through me. And eventually, the priest himself becomes the object of idolatry, claiming that this is that he's the intermediary, and that eventually some of them declared themselves as gods altogether. And things descended into actual worship of nature, worship of nature, and in some cases even worship of those custodians of these gods. I'm the representative of fire here on earth. Worship me. And so it became a means to exploit and control the people. Those are, this is the story of mankind. Power and all of the other senses that were gratified in this lust for power, this orgy for control. But it happened over centuries. Till Abraham came along, the world was steeped in idolatry. And his story, he reasoned that this is all a lie. There's one transcendent God. Life is human life is all equal. They created a whole hierarchy of life. There's the beginning of evolution, really. There's a whole hierarchy of life, and the weaker must, and it's destined to be consumed by the stronger. And they are the elite. Divine forces all must be surrendered to me. And children are offered on the altar even. But that was the law of the jungle, the law of life. I mean, Nazism is rooted in that. They simply believed that the Aryan race was the superior race. The Jew was the cancer. I don't want to digress, but the Jew was the cancer because the Jew, stubbornly, he was the symbol of this divine message that all people are made equal in the image of God. That is right out of the Torah. It's the foundation of Christianity and Islam. It's all rooted, Hitler realized, in Judaism, no secret, and that is the antithesis of Nazism, of progression, of science, which is the progression of humanity, evolution, the super race. And the Jew is his whole presence is this in defiance of the growth of humanity. Hitler said he was the Messiah, the words he used. He was going to redeem the world once and for all of this pernicious, cancerous disease called the Jew. And the root of it was that everybody's equal. That all people are made in the image of God. That life is sacred. No, it's evolution. He worshipped science. And there's evolution in humanity. That's what science is. It's all based on Darwin. But really, it started back here. It started back here all the way in prehistoric times. There are forces of nature. And nature, the law of nature is the survival of the fittest. And if you don't know that you're inferior, I'll tell you you are. And the proof that you are is that I'm in control of you. I'm stronger, faster, smarter, have more money. That's the proof that you have to serve me and offer your child on that in case you forget. So that's how it all began. So thus, but it all began with a subtle error. Initially, no one bought into this. No one even thought of it. Initially, there's God. However, to honor God, we have to acknowledge the forces of nature. Again, like like the king who sends you a gift. You say thank you, or a waiter. You're in a restaurant. The waiter doesn't own the food. You're paying the owner, but you have to say thank you to the waiter. That's being a mensch. That's decent. So we've got to erect these temples acknowledging the forces of nature, which are God's waiters or ministers. So read the paragraph again. Thus, the worship is rooted, read it again.
Thus, the worship of false divinities is rooted in a misunderstanding of the fact that God influences this world through intermediaries. Our sages comment, there is not a blade of grass on this material plane that does not have a spiritual force compelling it to grow. Idol worshippers, however, attach independent authority to these intermediaries, thinking they have control over the influence they disperse. In truth, these gods are merely an axe in the hand of a chopper, with no importance or will of their own, and therefore it is wrong and forbidden to worship them.
So you would say thank you to the waiter in the restaurant, but not to the fork. That would be foolish. When it comes to God, it's idolatrous. Now, the reason you thank the waiter is because the waiter has free choice. He didn't have to be there. So to some degree, he's there by choice. And moreover, the way he serves you, he can just, or she can just put the plate in front of you or do so with a smile. And so you're thanking, you're acknowledging their input in this service because there's an element of choice. But only human beings are granted choice. Nature is merely the axe in the hand of the woodchopper. So the woodchopper brings you the wood and you say thank you to the woodchopper and you go, and thank you to the axe, you're insulting the woodchopper actually. So that was their error. Nature, unlike humans, which do deserve thanks and appreciation because God granted us free choice, that's not true of nature. Now continue.
By saying Yisro had recognized all the false deities in the world, our sages implied that he was aware of all the different media through which God channels energy to the world. Despite his knowledge of these spiritual powers, he rejected their worship, declaring, "Blessed be God. Now I know that God is greater than all the deities."
He's kind of answered the question. Why would the Torah tell us that Yisro, in its second meaning of the word Kohen, meant that he was a priest and had served as a functionary and had participated in every idolatry? It's actually a great compliment. We're praising him. We're saying his understanding of the truth of God is absolute. He's explored every agency of nature and realized it's all an instrument in the hand of him. On the contrary, his was a rich and deep acknowledgement, not simply taught by someone accepted on a matter of, well, if you say so, but rather his own personal experience. He was the consummate Baal Tshuva, who had experienced the other side, an unholiness, and through his own search and endeavor had come to recognize the truth. That's far richer and deeper than one born into this environment and accepting it simply because maybe there's no alternative. So it's actually a compliment. Who comes to join the Jewish people? And as we'll explore, this is the name of the Parsha, Yisro. Who was Yisro? Kohen Midjan. He had experienced and explored it all. And he's come now to join the Jewish people. Thank you, Peggy. Let's continue. Robert, Yeshua.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The microcosm encouraging the macrocosm.
Okay.
Yitro's acknowledgement of God was not merely a personal matter. His words of praise brought about the revelation of God in his glory in the higher and lower realms. Afterwards, he gave the Torah in perfect confirmation of his dominion over all existence.
That was a quote from the Zohar. The Zohar, of course, is the classic and one of the primary works of the Kabbalah. And this is how the Zohar describes Yisro's arrival to the Jewish people and his conclusion. The glory of God in the higher and lower realms. And he grants Torah its perfect praise or confirmation of Torah's absolute truth of all of existence. He's qualified because he's experienced it all. Continue.
Yitro's individual acknowledgement of God expressed the purpose of the giving of the Torah. This prepared the macrocosm, the world at large, for such a revelation.
In other words, he's saying now that Yisro's coming is actually a template for our mission going forward with the giving of the Torah. He's our model. Let's continue to explain.
To explain, the Rambam states the Torah was given solely to create peace within the world. Yet peace is not the purpose for the Torah's existence. The Torah existed before the creation of the world. It is God's wisdom at one with him.
So continue where it's going, keep on going. Just as
God transcends the concept of purpose, so too does the Torah. The Rambam, however, focuses not on the purpose of the Torah itself, but on that of the giving of the Torah, where the Torah was granted to mortals. He explains that the Torah was given not merely to spread divine light, but to cultivate peace.
Okay, let's try and elaborate. He said something in these two paragraphs that is contains much nuance and depth and is very pithy. So he said two things. Our sages said the Torah was given to make peace in the world. However, that is the agenda of Torah. Make peace, overcome resistance, create harmony. Once that's done, do we need the Torah? There's peace. If Torah, this is for those who were here this morning, the earlier class. If Torah was only in order to fix a fragmented world, once the world is fixed, it's done its job, no need for Torah. But Torah is eternal because there's a deeper dimension to it. It's not merely a means by which to make peace, vanquish the enemy. And the enemy means ego and resistance and conflict and abuse and all of its guises and forms. That's the agenda, external dimension of Torah. The deeper dimension is Torah is the expression of God. It's about a relationship, a communion, and intimacy with God. Now, to achieve intimacy, there are many obstacles that have to be removed. First and foremost, the ego. If it's about me, it'll never be about you. And true intimacy is about you. So the big obstacle to overcome, to become one with anybody else, and certainly with God, is to remove me. That's work. Once that's done, it's just the union. It's the oneness. That's the deeper dimension of Torah. It's not merely a tool by which to refine, overcome, vanquish the world, but it's the expression of God's oneness. It's communion. It's being one with him. Now, therefore, going back to the peace dimension, so read another paragraph or two for us, Robert.
Okay. When the twains meet, peace refers to harmony between opposites. In an ultimate sense, it refers to a resolution of the dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual, forward movement enabling a world in which God's presence is not outwardly evident to recognize and be permeated by the truth of his being.
Whoa, what's he saying? All right, so the Torah was given to make peace in the world. This is the agenda of Torah before it's finally realized. Then there's the essence of it. He just says, what's the ultimate peace? The obvious peace, of course, is conflict, outright conflict between people, nations, and so on. Parents, children. There's naturally conflict everywhere because we're all born selfish. We are born selfish. All we know is me, I, and we can never escape that. So there's conflict embedded, in every moment of our lives. So there's a constant war to overcome that, as I said before. Now, the root of this conflict, of this dichotomy or division, is the division between heaven and earth to begin with, the physical and the spiritual. So Torah was given to make peace on all of the levels of conflict, ego, peace in families and communities, the nations of the world, and ultimately God and man, heaven and earth. That's the root of the whole conflict. The root is that God created the world in such a way that he is not felt here. He's concealed. And what emerges is ego and conflict with him and with each other. And ever since the Torah was given, we are dissolving that conflict mitzvah by mitzvah, ultimately transforming it. Continue. On the verse,
On the verse, the heavens are the heavens of God, but the earth he gave to the children of man. Our sages explained that originally it was a divine decree separating the physical from the spiritual. In other words, the nature of material existence prevented one from truly appreciating spiritual reality. At the time of the giving of the Torah, however, God nullified this decree and allowed for unity to be established between the two.
in other words, before the Torah was given, there were two realities: heaven, spirituality, one reality, and physicality, the physical world. That's why our forefathers were all shepherds, they were meditators, they were transcenders, because in their desire for a relationship with God, that meant divesting themselves from the body. That's why, again, they were shepherds, affording themselves hours, days and nights in solitude and meditation. They interacted with the world as little as possible. But then the Torah was given and said, God said, enough. Now we're going to dissolve the barrier between heaven and earth, mitzvah by mitzvah. Go do it. Bring heaven down to earth. Make peace between soul and body, spirit and matter. Continue.
Moreover, true peace involves more than the mere negation of opposition. The intent is that forces which were previously at odds should recognize a common ground and join together in a positive activity.
So peace is not simply we don't fight anymore. That's not peace. That's maybe silence. Maybe. You do your thing, I do my thing, and don't bother me, I won't bother you. That's not peace. Peace is oneness. When the differences between us, we simply don't just say, well, that's what it is, so that's it. You do your thing, I'll do my thing, which would mean kind of on many levels, in terms of our Yiddishkeit, would mean, Shabbos is Shabbos. I'm very spiritual, then I'm into that world. But then the weekday is the weekday. It's another world. When I daven, I'm in one place. When I eat, I'm in another place. I just simply separate the two. There's no conflict. No, that's not peace. The peace is where the physical itself becomes suffused with the spiritual. The physical moment itself is a spiritual moment, and the spiritual moment embraces the physical. Harmony. All right? Similarly,
the peace which the Torah fosters does not merely involve a revelation of godliness so great that the material world is forced to acknowledge it. Instead,
what he means now is a little bit a nuance. Peace is not when the enemy gives up. Okay, have your way. That's not peace either. Rather, Torah's intent. Instead, yes. Go on.
Instead, the Torah's intent is to bring about an awareness of God within the context of the world itself.
Go on.
There's a godliness in every element of existence. Every moment, creation is being renewed. Were God's creative energy to be lacking, the world would return to absolute nothingness. The Torah allows us to appreciate this inner godliness and enables us to live in harmony with it.
All right. So he's saying, what's the purpose of the mitzvah? The purpose of the mitzvah in the end is to overcome all resistance, elevate and refine the world mitzvah by mitzvah, so that ultimately heaven and earth fuse and become one. We aren't about fixing anything anymore. We're about being one with God eternally, ever deeper. That's the whole goal. And Yisro is the model for it. Final paragraph.
In a personal sense, Yitro's acknowledgement of God's supremacy accomplished this objective. From his involvement with all the false deities in the world, he came to a deep recognition of God's sovereignty. The transformation of Yitro made possible the giving of the Torah, which in turn transforms the world.
Okay, he's saying let me add to this. He's saying Yisro on a personal level, he achieved the whole objective of giving of the Torah, which is why the Parsha that the Torah is given is named after him. Because the giving of the Torah is about revealing God in everything, even that which initially had opposed him and defied him. So who greater example is that than Yisro? Yisro had explored everything, and here's what he doesn't say. He found God there. He realized that this was all a corrupted quest for God. And in the experiences that he had come from, he realized that the core of it is all the divine. And he's bringing that all with him to his Yiddishkeit, not leaving it behind. His Yiddishkeit was profoundly, his relationship with God, incredibly textured and deep because of all of the experiences he's had in these cults and occults, but now all reflective and transparent of Hashem. Because everything in the end comes from God. And all of those experiences are just simply terribly corrupted and misfired. But he redeemed them all. He brought them all with him. So with great honor and respect, we say, here cometh, thus cometh the priest of Midian. He brings with him the priesthood, all of the experiences. He bears, as it were, every scar, but no, not as a scar, but as a true badge of divine honor, reflecting the presence of God that he had discovered in every part of God's world, even its darkest corners. The ultimate Baal Tshuva that redeems every, even the nadir of existence, where the tzaddik dare not go, cannot go, ought not go. But the Baal Tshuva, the Yisro, is able to, and did, and does. And so of all of the people in the world, the name of the Parshas is not called Moses, not called Aaron, it's called Yisro, because this is the whole purpose. Jacob, read for us the next section, please. The Zohar.
The Zohar, I have from darkness to light, no?
That's the heading, correct, yeah.
Oh, okay. From darkness to light. The Zohar associates the transformation of material existence with the verse, I saw an advantage to the light over darkness. The word Yisaron, in Hebrew Yisaron, sharing the same root as the name Yisro, Yisroi, translated as advantage, can also be rendered as higher quality. Thus, the verse can be interpreted to indicate that light which comes from the transformation of darkness possesses a higher quality.
This is a very deep idea because darkness transforms into light. What does this mean? Darkness is just the absence of light. You put the light on, it's not transformed. It doesn't exist. But there is a kind of darkness that has reality. It's a darkness which is not really the absence of light, but God deliberately creates. And what is it? It's a darkness that's a distortion of a very deep truth. That's a much greater darkness. Not just lack of enlightenment, but an exploitation in a very nefarious and destructive way of something deeply true. That's much more painful.
Example?
And it's that Yisro transforms. The idolatry, and all of that idolatry, was really, what was at the end of the day? It was really people as a quest for something higher, for some purpose and some meaning. But it ended up being terribly abusive and sacrificial of children and brought untold suffering. Untold suffering. Again, Nazism is the ultimate of this perspective of the destiny of the weaker to serve the more powerful. Untold suffering. And that's the most painful. Yet Yisro is taking all of this and actually redeeming it all. The quest of it all, the search of it all, it's really coming from a very, very deep place. And I speak not of those who abused it, but those caught up in it. So Yisro means transformation. Transformation of darkness into light. So there, continue, one more paragraph, 2 implications. Go on.
There are 2 implications to this. Firstly, that the transformation of darkness results in a higher quality of light than would otherwise be revealed. And secondly, that this higher light does not stand in opposition to the material world. On the contrary, the darkness of the world is its source.
Right. Just to translate this in a very, very kind of simple and what I'm looking for, it's not dramatic example of this idea of transforming darkness into light. When somebody, even a child, misbehaves, lashes out inappropriate, does destructive things. So there's one way to resolve the problem is, you just put your foot down and this is not acceptable and there are consequences and that's it. And the child learns not to do it because if the child does, there's a consequence. It's painful. But the other way is to understand where's this coming from. It's negative, but it's motivated by something. Like in everything, there is a kernel of truth that needs to be embraced. It needs to be nurtured. So then if you deal with it that way, you're transforming the problem. You're not just defeating the problem, you're transforming it. This is what true therapy should be, is to get to the root of this destructive, lashing out, whatever indulgent, whatever the destructive behavior might be, is to understand it at its core and transform it. That's the ultimate victory. Everything in God's world is a corruption of some truth. And the more corrupted, the deeper the truth. The greater the battle to get to it. But the end, redeemable. That's what Yisro represents. So let's conclude here. And I don't see, are you on, Anne? Have you joined us? For some reason I cannot. Let me see if I look. I just can't get all the names up. You're not. Okay. Oh, Anne, are you there? No. Ethel, I see you here. Would you read for us the last section, please?
Sure. The path to redemption. The Tanya describes the giving of the Torah as a foretaste of the era of the redemption. For when the Torah was given, all existence stood in a state of absolute oneness with God. At the time of the giving of the Torah, however, the revelation was dependent on God's initiative. Since the world had not yet been refined, its nature stood in opposition to the manifestation of godliness, and so the miraculous revelation did not endure. In the centuries that followed, however, mankind's observance of the Torah and its mitzvahs has slowly woven godliness into the fabric of the world. In the era of the redemption, the dichotomy will be permanently dissolved, and we will realize that our world is God's dwelling.
So you're saying we stand very close to that. Mitzvah by mitzvah, for the thousands of years we've been in exile, doing mitzvahs with the material, physical world, elevating the sparks or dissolving the resistance, if not perceptive to the naked eye, undercurrent, it's all happening and it builds on itself. And now we're ready for the world to be God's home, and a home is a place where every detail is a reflection of the ones who live there, particularly the woman who is the home. That's what a home is. Every detail is you. So one day the whole world is going to be every detail an expression of Hashem. And we've arrived at that mitzvah by mitzvah. It's been a battle, overcoming resistance. But we're very close because it's all collective. If the eyes are open, we can see how close the world is to this moment, notwithstanding the fluff and the nonsense on the surface, but the strong undercurrents of incredible change about to be realized. Again, we point this out all the time. There's no place in the world where a Jew is not free to keep Shabbos and keep kosher. This has not been true for thousands of years. It's true today. No place in the world, including even Iran. You can be an observant Jew. They will respect you for that. Communist Russia, that imprisoned my family, some arrested, never seen of again, is supportive of Jewish life, building Chabad houses in places where Jews have been imprisoned and tortured for observing the very same mitzvahs. This is happening everywhere in the world. Our former enemies in the Middle East kind of lining up to make peace, despite our ridiculous policies, despite us. That's because of all of the mitzvahs that have been done over the millennia are bearing fruit. The world is just opening up. And even this crazy liberalism, which on the surface is the most destructive thing ever to plague man, the root of it is really wonderful. The idea of equality and embracing everyone is good. The deep error is equality doesn't mean you're the same. We respect your difference. Harmony, not a singular note, not a singular instrument, but be true to thine self. created by God. That's harmony. We're not far from that realization. Not far at all. It takes a little bit of enlightenment, a little bit of chassidus, a little bit of spreading the word, and aha, the eureka moment is that far away from humanity at large. It's up to you and I to spread the light. So Yisro, in conclusion, is the symbol of it all. He's come from the depth, from the darkness, explored it all, discovered God everywhere, and brings all of these experiences with him in his declaration that Hashem is the truth. So if there's ever a symbol in our history of what the giving of the Torah is all about, not Moses, not Aaron, not Abraham, but Yisro, for the reasons we explained this morning. Thank you all for joining. Let's all say hello to each other. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you to our readers and listeners.
Thank
and
you, Rabbi.
newcomers.
Thank you.
Morning.
Morning.
Hi.
Thank you.
Wonderful week. Right, if you haven't registered yet for the
Thank you, Rabbi.
next Wednesday, the
I saw it. I don't know if I can handle it.
Stay well, Brian. Good to see you, Brian. Stay
Yeah.
well.
yeah, so you'll know to recognize heaven when you come there. You won't be, you'll know exactly what it is. Oh, I learned about this. This ain't it, or this is it. You'll know. You'll be
Yeah.
able to embrace the moment. All right, friends, have a wonderful week.
All the best.
Take care. Take care.
Great. Shabbat Tov. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi. Have a great day, everybody.
Please, God.
You